Yes, so I'm going to be talking about when, who, and how to construct estimands, and then I'll go through how we recently constructed estimands for a new trial in opiate detoxification. So hopefully when to construct estimands should already be quite clear from yesterday that this comes early on in study development. So this is after general trial objectives have been established so that the study can be designed, conducted, and analysed to achieve the desired objectives. So to begin constructing estimands, you do need a clear understanding of the general trial objectives. So this requires knowing who will use the results and what decisions they'll make. For example, are the results of interest to policymakers, payers, prescribers, etc. Then you can define the general question of interest to the decision maker. For example, a policymaker might want to understand the effect of treatment if it were introduced into routine practice, whereas a prescriber might want to know the treatment effect if taken as directed. So the estimand needs to align with the decision maker's needs. And it might well be that a trial needs to address the needs of multiple different stakeholders. And this would be important to understand at this stage, leading to multiple objectives and estimands. Then the who should be involved when constructing estimands. I hope it's already quite clear that this should be a multidisciplinary undertaking, so involving all those normally involved in protocol development. So this including clinical team members, statisticians, and other stakeholders. Once the right people are assembled, then estimand construction can then proceed. Now, there isn't really one single right way to construct estimands. Essentially, the construction just requires an iterative thinking process, during which all 5 estimand attributes are formulated. And this will be done in a way that's appropriate for the trial objective and the decision maker's needs. Generally, the thinking process should consider what's clinically relevant to know for the particular therapeutic setting. You need to identify all plausible intercurrent events. Then you can discuss strategies to handle these. And then you complete the specification of all 5 estimand attributes, such that every component of the estimand aligns with the trial objective. So you do also need to consider whether you can derive a reliable estimate for decision making, hence why this can be iterative. Now, when it comes to identifying intercurrent events, this involves thinking through and listing all plausible events that could occur after randomization and affect either the interpretation or the existence of patient outcomes. Now, there's no set number of events that you need to consider. Looking at trials in similar areas might help guide you as to what events would be relevant in your particular setting. And we've seen the examples that ICH has given. So these include use of alternative treatment, discontinuation of treatment, treatment switching, and dose alterations, and terminal events such as death. But there really are many others, and some will be quite context specific, as you'll see in the case study I've got coming up. Now, it's also important to think about the anticipated rates of occurrence for events, as this might inform the strategy for handling. So you can then begin to discuss how intercurrent events should be handled in line with the objective. So yesterday we met the 5 strategies that we can use. And it might be that you need to use different strategies for different events in the same trial. So we saw that's been done for the COVID vaccine trials and in other trials such as the surgical trial. And at this point, it might become clear that how to properly handle an event might also depend on the underlying reason. For example, different strategies for treatment discontinuation due to adverse events versus lack of efficacy. So some separating out of different types of event might be useful here. Now, of course, the most appropriate strategy for each intercurrent event will be entirely context specific. So I'm afraid I can't give any further universal guidance here. But once you've thought through your intercurrent events, you can then pin down the 5 estimand attributes. So this includes precisely specifying the treatment conditions. And so where relevant, these should include doses for the initially randomized treatments and background therapies, allowable rescue medications and prohibited concomitant medications as suggested by the addendum. So as such, some intercurrent events can be included in the definition of the treatment condition, so it's immediately clear what you're comparing. And the population and variable attributes might also involve clarifying how some intercurrent events will be handled. So for example, if we're using the principal stratum strategy, this will modify the population element. Or if we're using a composite or a while-in treatment strategy, this might impact our variable attribute. But any intercurrent events that we've not included in the treatment, population or variable can then be clarified separately under handling of intercurrent events. Now, the 5th element of the estimand is the population level summary measure. Now, as different summary measures can give quite different impressions, it's important to ensure that the summary measure specified will align with the trial objective. So I'd like you to think about this example that was considered by Kahan et al. So this was investigating whether an intervention reduces deaths entirely in COVID-19. Now, in this setting, potential summary measures for a survival outcome include a hazard ratio for time to death, or we could look at the proportion of deaths at a particular time point. So the graph on screen here is showing for each treatment arm the cumulative proportion of mortality over time. Now, suppose it happened like we see here, that the intervention simply delays death, but ultimately both treatments end up with the same number of deaths at 28 days. Now, if you opted for a hazard ratio, the intervention might appear better here. So the hazard ratio is 0.9, but this wouldn't really be helpful as the aim isn't to extend survival. So at day 28, we see there's actually no difference in the proportions of deaths. So here, the hazard ratio is not aligning with the objective of examining whether the treatment reduces deaths entirely. So the difference in proportion would be more suitable. Now, another subtle issue arises for odds ratios and hazard ratios that it's important to be aware of. Now, conditioning on a covariate in the analysis, such as, for example, age, changes the very nature of the treatment effect that's being estimated for such measures. And this is due to non-collapsibility of odds ratios and hazard ratios. So for a nice discussion and example of this issue, you can see this recent great reference by Morris et al. And for a full technical explanation as to why this occurs, do see the reference by Daniels. The point is, it's important to clarify whether you're seeking a conditional or a marginal estimand for such measures. For example, do you want to know the conditional odds ratio for treatment comparing people of the same age? Or maybe you want the odds ratio in the population that includes people of different ages, as these could end up being quite different in magnitude. Now, this subtlety doesn't arise for continuous outcomes that are analysed using linear models and summarised with a mean difference, or when risk differences or risk ratios are used for binary outcomes from possum models, as marginal and conditional estimands coincide for these measures. But this is an important issue to be aware of when you're using odds ratios and hazard ratios. So just to clarify if you're seeking a marginal or a conditional estimand. Now, having specified all 5 attributes, it should then be agreed that reliable estimation is possible before the choice of estimand is finalised. Now, if not, an alternative estimand would need to be considered, hence why the construction is considered an iterative process, or it can be. Okay, so after that general sort of look at who, when and how, I'm now going to outline how we constructed estimands for forwards 2. So you'll see this has a variety of interesting intercurrent events in opiate addiction. So addiction to opiates such as heroin or morphine is a major challenge worldwide. And currently the only treatment option is opiate detoxification therapy. So this involves switching from an uncontrolled substance to a substitute controlled by a doctor. And this is commonly methadone. Then the dose of the methadone is gradually reduced until complete abstinence is achieved. But currently, despite complete detoxification is not often achieved due to presence or fear of withdrawal symptoms. But recent evidence from alcoholism suggests that adding baclofen to the detoxification therapy will facilitate detoxification as it helps improve withdrawal symptoms. So this is where forwards 2 comes in. So it's a proof of concept, double-blind, randomized placebo-controlled trial, and it's currently in the design stage. Now, the general trial objective is to determine if baclofen shows potential effectiveness in reducing methadone detoxification therapy compared to placebo. So in the trial, patients will be randomized to take baclofen or placebo alongside their usual detoxification treatment. And the primary outcomes to be the reduction in the methadone dose at 12 weeks. Now, if this proof of concept study shows baclofen is potentially beneficial, then a subsequent larger definitive phase 3 trial will be designed, and this will have the ultimate outcome of abstinence. So the results of forwards 2 are therefore going to be of interest to payers and investigators who may support a larger definitive trial, and also prescribers and patients. So when did we construct estimands for forwards? Well, we first sat down to think about estimands at the initial planning stages to inform the protocol development. So I set up a meeting specifically designated to discuss what we want to find out. So this included the trial statisticians, the PI, and the lead clinical researcher. And at the meeting, I gave a short introduction to Estimands, and we discussed the general trial objective that I've just shown to you on the previous slide. So we then thought through what intercurrent events were relevant. So recall, in this trial, the patients will be supplementing their standard methadone detoxification therapy with either baclofen or placebo. So the events that we identified included, firstly, stopping the randomized treatment for any reason. So this would be stopping the additional component of their treatment pathway, as shown in the bottom half of the figure here. Secondly, it could be that participants end up changing the dose of their randomized treatment. So they change the dose of the baclofen or placebo. Again, this is the second part of their treatment. Now, thirdly, it was raised how some patients would just give up on abstinence from methadone and discontinue their detoxification pathway element of the treatment prior to the 12-week time point. So that is, they decide they no longer want to keep lowering their methadone to achieve abstinence. So essentially, we can think about this as dropping out of the standard part of the treatment, dropping out of usual care. So this is what's shown in the top half of the figure. Now, fourthly, patients could be on other commonly prescribed medications. For example, they could be on any depression or anxiety medication. And it was anticipated that this could be quite common amongst the study population. Fifth, it was discussed that some patients could actually relapse and use other uncontrolled substances on top of their methadone, such as heroin. And this would actually clinically be considered worse than baseline. But it was also raised how it was unclear how often this would occur and actually be reported, because patients might actually be disinclined to tell investigators for fear of withdrawal of their methadone prescriptions. And then there's also the potential amongst this population that patients might unfortunately die. But this was felt to be uncommon. But overall, we've got a total of 6 events to think about here. So we then discussed handling these. So we started with stopping the randomized treatment and also detoxification treatment discontinuation. Now, in an ideal world, the investigators would like everyone in the trial to be committed to detoxification throughout the 12 weeks and also remain on the randomized treatment. This so that they can understand how the treatment performs under optimal conditions. But we quickly established that this would never be possible for this difficult population. Now, in detox clinics, up to 50% of patients drop out prior to complete detoxification. So given this, we agreed it was unlikely that we'd be able to reliably estimate how the treatment performs under optimal conditions, because these optimal conditions just don't exist. So it was established in the first instance, in order to inform the later definitive trial, that would be of interest to know how baclofen compared to placebo, regardless of any randomized treatment discontinuation or any detoxification treatment discontinuation prior to stopping their methadone. And so we would use a treatment policy strategy to handle these. So for the therapy ultimately to be useful to prescribe in practice for policymakers and payers, it would need to show promising signs regardless of such events. But I will come back to these shortly, as we're also planning another Estimand to explore how the treatment works during adherence. So we then established the treatment policy strategy would also be most useful for changing doses of treatment and use of other medication, and also for the relapse and use on top. So it was of interest to know the treatment effect despite any of these events occurring. But the relapse was an interesting one that we had a lot of discussion around, as the clinicians raised how really this is a worse state than baseline, but how also they had raised how it would be unclear how often relapse would occur and be reported, because the patients probably wouldn't tell investigators because they would fear having their methadone withdrawn. So we kind of concluded that we wouldn't accurately be able to know whether any of the relapse or use on tops events occurred. So we settled on a treatment policy in the first instance for handling this. But we will separately assess the numbers of reported relapse by arm to inform the latest definitive trial. And we have a supplementary Estimand exploring this, which you'll see shortly. Now for death, we also had a lot of debate, as this is the worst, really is the worst outcome. And one of the strategies for handling death wasn't really felt to be ideal. And in this patient population, deaths are anticipated to be unrelated to the randomized treatment, but it could be related to an uncontrolled substance use. So in the first instance, we decided that we'll be using the while alive strategy, and so we'll only be interested in outcomes whilst alive, and we'll separately be closely assessing deaths by arm. But again, as I'll show you shortly, we've got another approach proposed for handling death to inform the latest definitive trial. So after thinking about the intercurrent events, we then constructed the 5 Estimand attributes. So in the treatment condition specification, we included how randomized treatment adherence and detoxification treatment discontinuation were handled. We included these here as they're intrinsically related, so it was clear exactly what we were comparing. And so we formed this as 12 weeks of baclofen compared to placebo, regardless of any randomized treatment discontinuation for any reason, or regardless of any detoxification treatment discontinuation prior to stopping methadone. Now you'll note we haven't actually got the dose of baclofen or placebo in this yet. And that's because the dose of baclofen will be confirmed shortly as established in a current dose finding study, but that will be added to our treatment condition once we know that. Now the population was to be broad and the population of eligible trial participants. So that's all those engaging in detoxification treatment as defined by the trial exclusion and inclusion criteria. So this wasn't to be restricted by a baseline characteristic or a potential intercurrent event. So the outcome was a reduction in the methadone dose at 12 weeks. Now in the larger definitive trial, the primary outcome will be complete abstinence, but it would be infeasible to consider this binary response at this proof of concept stage regarding sample size and finances. And the population level summary measure of interest was the mean treatment group difference in methadone dose at week 12. Now, as noted before, we did have a lot of debate on handling the relapses and deaths. So for this proof of concept study, we have also defined a second Estimand that will use a composite strategy to handle both relapse and death, everything else staying the same in the Estimand. So this will incorporate these 2 events into the treatment effect as a poor outcome. And specifically what we're going to do is we're actually going to use ranking methods. So we're going to rank all patient outcomes who don't die or relapse according to their change in the methadone dose. Then the patients who relapse will be given a poorer rank, and patients who die will be given an even poorer rank. And this is so overall we can compare how baclofen compares against placebo, including the impacts of death and relapse with the actual outcome of interest. Now, it was also established how it was of interest to understand how baclofen compared to placebo only whilst patients were on randomized treatment and in their detoxification treatment pathway. So we wanted to know the treatment effect up to 12 weeks. So this was to get a handle on how baclofen compared to placebo during adherence. So this was of key interest to investigators, and they said it would be of interest to prescribers. So we've also got a further additional Estimand where 1 and 2 are going to be handled using a while-on treatment strategy. And we are also going to do some exploratory work looking at a principal stratum strategy for handling 1 and 2. This is to understand how the treatment performs for the subset of individuals who would always adhere to randomized treatment and stick to the detox pathway. Now the investigators were really keen on this Estimand, but I have my concerns about how reliably we're going to be able to estimate this. Because to estimate this analysis will be highly assumption-led and involve modelling to identify those individuals who would always adhere to the treatment. So the reliability of this Estimand is currently unclear, but I think it will be useful exploration in this proof of concept study to potentially inform the latest definitive trial. But given the reliability uncertainties, we will be conducting several sensitivity analyses around the assumptions made to estimate this to unravel if it's useful or not. It may or may not be useful. So just to finish, looking back on the construction process, I just wanted to sort of reflect on how it did take us time to identify the plausible intercurrent events in this setting and how to handle them, especially whilst estimands are new, as the process started with me explaining estimands in general to the team. And defining the estimands really was an iterative thinking process requiring multidisciplinary input. But ultimately, it was really beneficial as it will assure that forwards 2 here appropriately answers the questions of interest. I think in the past, how deaths or relapses have been handled in similar trials is unclear. Here, it will be fully transparent on how we're addressing these, and the results will inform what strategies to take forward to the definitive trial. We do have a few estimands here, but that's because there's unanswered questions at this proof of concept stage, as in for who and how the treatment works. But that brings me to the end of my slides now. So I'll look to James to see if we've got any questions.
Thanks very much, Susie. That was really great, really clear, I thought. We got a couple of questions in the chat, and if anyone wants to unmute or put their hand up, and then we can call you to ask a question out loud. So, Katie, why don't you? I think you've got questions in the chat, so why don't you follow up with those?
Hi, thank you very much for this very useful workshop yesterday and today. So I was handling this Estimand strategy just recently. I am still in the process. I didn't have any problem with familiarity with Estimand because the company already had several of Estimand workshop for everyone. The only problem I had was the question I was getting is that because we are developing new drug, so people have to be followed up after treatment duration pass for safety. And the question I got from, it's one of the estimands that we suggested was for the people who had used prohibited medicine, because the clinicians were very insistent that if they use prohibited medicine, the drug that we are investigating is the effect of it is going to be diluted. So we want to avoid that. We don't know the percentage or anything, but we came up with the composite estimand after several sessions for the duration of the treatment. Then the question came up, how are you gonna use composite estimand strategy for safety monitoring part when you are reporting safety? How are you going to report those patients who had prohibited medicine? Oh, by the way, we decided that we will keep the people who have used prohibited medicine in the trial on the treatment because there was a safety issue as well. So they're going to carry on all the way until the end of the whole study, treatment duration and safety monitoring. That was one question. And there's another question.
So can we take that one, Katie, first, and then?
Yeah, sure. Go on.
So I think there's quite a lot of unanswered questions around the analysis of safety data and how estimands can be useful there, because there's a lot of different things to think about there. So I can't really offer you any solid advice on exactly what estimands and what the best approach is for handling safety outcomes. Because again, I think it's very context specific. I mean, it might be that you want to use a similar strategy to your primary efficacy outcome or different, but I think this is why estimand construction really does require multidisciplinary conversations, because you need the guidance from the clinicians on what they feel is most appropriate and how to sort of tackle your safety outcomes.
Okay, thanks very much.
Sorry, can I carry on or no?
I think it might be nice to ask one of the other questions in the chat, if that's okay, Katie.
Sure.
I wondered if we could, if you could comment on Lee Middleton's question, Susie. How are you considering the potential for withdrawal and loss to follow-up in your Estimand planning? And that relates to a previous point that was raised. Is there any inflation for sample size? I think that's one you raised, Katie, allowing for missing data. So
that's so missing data and loss to follow-up doesn't really come into the Estimand. It's obviously a very important issue that we need to think about, but we think about that when we get to thinking about our statistical analysis methods and how we're going to target our Estimands. Well, obviously there will be some missing data involved, but that's an additional sort of considerations here, and we will be thinking through appropriately what assumptions we should be making for people who we don't observe their methadone dose. But actually the Estimand framework has been very helpful in this setting, because it took us it's been helpful for us to unravel that actually patients, there actually could be quite little loss to follow up here, because the outcomes methadone dose, the people aren't really going to get lost to follow up because they're always coming back to get their methadone dose. There might be some that just disappear because they move or they go away, but actually the missing data is less of an issue here, because by the nature of the outcome, these people are wanting to come back and get their methadone. But we don't need to factor that into the Estimand. That comes later on. And so I guess so with regards to sample size inflation, with sample size calculation here, the sample size is being established around the effect size that we envisage observing given that we're using a treatment policy Estimand here. So we've factored that into our size. Because of that, we don't sort of need to do any inflation of the sample size because of the Estimand. But thinking about the missing data, we have done just a separate inflation for that, which is more of the analysis issue again.
Thanks, Susie. And a final quick question from Dawn, I think. So she was asking sort of quite a practical question. How developed do your estimands need to be when you're applying for funding at the proposal stage, and how much can be done post-funding? I don't know if you can comment on your experience with relation to that.
Yeah, so I have to say, so for this trial that I'm just talking about now, it was actually submitted to the funders quite a few years ago in 2018. So before Estimands really was right there in my forefront. So in this grant application, Estimands weren't there because this has been part of a two-stage trial. But going through this experience, sort of, I realised now the time that it took to really sort of pin down all the intercurrent events and carefully think through them is really sort of it took time really that you wouldn't really have when you're putting your grant application together before you've got the resources there. So I think with grant applications, it's an interesting question that I'd like to get funders' perspective on. But I think we can always put in sort of like a top level summary of what Estimand we're targeting. Like we probably won't have all the details thought through, but I think it could be useful to put in as much as we can at that stage, because it will allow the funders to sort of assess that we're designing the trial in the right way, because they need to assess that the sample size is going to be adequate. So I think we can put in some information. I think it's probably too much to expect all the details to go in. But again, I think this is a really important area that's sort of worthy of consensus on. I mean, these are just my thoughts on it today.
Thank you very much. That's great. So thanks for those questions. And I'm sorry we haven't been able to deal with all of them. We'll try and come back to some of them later, but do feel free to remind us of your question if you feel it's still unanswered. So I'd like to thank you very much, Susie. And then I think our next speaker, if I can briefly introduce him, is Brian Goldman. He's Principal Statistician at Novo Nordisk. And Brian, if you're there, if you could share your slides.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Great.
All right. I'll see if I can get my slides up here. Yes. Yes. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's actually very exciting to join in on this workshop and hear a little bit about the discussions going on around Estimands in this group. It's fantastic. I can say these slides are relating to a trial that's now a few years old from Novo Nordisk, where I'm working. Sustain 8. It's a trial in type 2 diabetes. It was a phase 3B trial comparing one of our products, semaglutide, against a competitor product called canagliflozin. It's a bit of a mouthful. As an add-on to first-line therapy. And I can say these slides are a joint work between myself and Helle Lundgaard, who's also a statistician here at Novo Nordisk, who's really been driving a lot of the work going on in the Estimand framework. And then just to get this out of the way, the opinions that I'm presenting here, I can definitely say that they don't necessarily represent the views of everyone here at Novo Nordisk. There have been some lively discussions around Estimands here over the years. But just to kind of start things off, and I think it kind of ties in with the last question regarding when do we need to work Estimands into a trial. And I can say that the way that the process works for us at Novo is that it's very much considered an integral part of the protocol at this point. So,
Brian, sorry to interrupt, but your slides
yes.
are not moving. Your slides, your
Oh,
screen is
dear.
not moving here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think you're sharing the wrong screen. We can see your
Interesting.
not the
Okay.
presenting screen.
Okay. Let me try one more time here. We did practice this before. If I share, yeah. No, it's not letting me do that.
If it's helpful, Brian, I can always share your slides and then you can tell me when to go to the next slide.
That would be fine. Suddenly now it's not letting me share at all. Interesting. Sorry for the technical glitch.
Here we go. Let me share your slides and let me know
That's
when you
great.
want the next one.
Yes, if you could move forward, I think it's slide 3. Yeah. So as I was saying, yeah. So we very much think about the Estimand definition. It's pretty well standard practice, I would say, to think in the Estimand definition at the same time as we're working out the objectives of the trial. So in that light, and then I guess another point I can make is that this is a trial that was the protocol was finalized over 5 years ago. So we have in some places sort of, you could say, updated the wording a little bit compared to what we originally had in the protocol. You know, this is a fast moving field, and our understanding of estimands has changed a little bit since then. So for example, when we were the objective that was defined, the primary objective that was defined in the protocol for this trial is this text written in italics. We had set out to compare the effect of semaglutide against this competitor product on glycemic control, which is typically measured using a blood glucose measure called HbA1c. In subjects with type 2 diabetes. I guess to update that into what we would currently, how we would currently specify, we would actually split this objective up into 2, because we both had a primary objective to confirm non-inferiority using this non-inferiority margin of 0.3 percentage points. But then we also, if we confirmed non-inferiority, then we actually were interested in going on to test superiority and confirm that. Yeah, next slide, please. And so when thinking about the Estimand, the primary Estimand in this trial, we had perhaps a somewhat simpler scenario than what Susie just described. We identified 2 intercurrent events that were likely to occur frequently enough to require explicitly defining our strategy for handling them. And they were treatment discontinuation for any reason and use of what's called rescue medication. So for patients whose glucose does not come under control, they might require additional glucose lowering therapy, referred to as rescue therapy. And for the primary Estimand, both of these were handled by a hypothetical strategy, meaning that data that was collected after those intercurrent events occurred was not included in the primary analysis. And we'll get into a little bit more detail about that. Next slide. And then this one's animated. Sorry, Susie. So thinking about this Estimand in terms of the 5 attributes defined by the ICH guidelines, We had a population level summary measure as the difference between means, and then in the change in this blood glucose measure after a year in these patients. That defines our population, and then the treatment conditions that we've already discussed, semaglutide against canagliflozin. And then the last part is maybe the one that we spend the most time discussing, the strategies for intercurrent events. And in a hypothetical strategy, we were interested in the effect had patients always adhered to their assigned treatment and had rescue medication not been available. As Susie alluded to, this is the effect that clinicians are often interested in when describing, sitting with a patient in front of them and describing what treatment benefit they can expect to have if they remain on treatment. This is the estimate that they often express an interest in. Yeah, next slide. And so the rationale for this primary estimand, I think in addition to this notion of it being clinically relevant, it's especially so in this particular situation in a non-inferiority setting. And I just clipped out some text from the protocol that it assesses the glycemic benefit a person with type 2 diabetes is expected to achieve if initiating and continuing treatment with semaglutide compared to doing the same with canagliflozin. And these are both without the potential effect of rescue medication. That's at least the target of estimation. And the idea is that this will avoid confounding from rescue medication. And this is especially important in a non-inferiority setting as additional medications beyond what's included in the protocol and the randomized treatment will tend to move the estimate closer to the null. So it's actually not conservative in a non-inferiority setting. And this estimand was also in line with the primary estimands in the phase 3A studies for the clinical program. Next slide, please. So how was the process of deciding on this estimand? I guess I could say that it's been a learning process. It was a learning process at that time, and it's been a learning process ever since. The protocol was actually finalized at the end of 2016, which was prior to the release of the draft ICH guidance. So we were, you could say, flying in the dark a little bit. It was the process was very much driven by the statistician, and it was done in alignment with previous trials in the same clinical program, and as well as previous trials in other diabetes projects. So it was very much about aligning to what we had previously done and aligning as much as possible to current practice at the time that the trial was planned. I think what we aim for currently is to have a process in which the clinician takes a much more active role with support from the statistician as the target of estimation. You know, what is the clinically relevant question is not a purely statistical question. Yeah, next slide. In addition to the primary estimand, we defined an additional estimand in which both the intercurrent events were handled by a treatment policy strategy. This was identified to be of interest to regulators already at that time, and it's only become more so since then. And that was primarily due to the superiority objectives that were included in this trial. Yeah, next slide. And so thinking about this additional estimand in terms of the 5 components, the first 4 components are exactly the same. And it was only the last part, if you click once more, the strategies for intercurrent events, where now we're interested in the treatment effect, irrespective of adherence to investigational medicinal product, and with and including use of rescue medication as required. Yeah. Next slide. And so with all of those aspects in mind, this was the trial design that we wound up with. And I guess a key aspect of this is that patients were randomized and were indeed followed for the entire 52-week treatment duration plus 5-week follow-up, off-treatment follow-up period, regardless of whether they stopped treatment during the course of the trial or whether they initiated any kind of rescue medication. So the idea was to follow this planned trial design as closely as possible. Next slide. And this is just to illustrate that the different strategies for addressing intercurrent events could potentially lead to different data collection focuses, and especially since we had included the additional treatment policy strategy for both intercurrent events in the additional estimand, that required an intense focus on patient retention and collection of their data even after experiencing these intercurrent events. Next slide. And this is the last slide. I could see the comment about 5 minutes. And this is just to emphasize that, especially in a trial where any intercurrent events are being addressed using a treatment policy strategy, follow-up on all randomized patients is required in order to enable valid estimation. And it is our experience that regulators generally prefer an estimand where all intercurrent events are handled by the treatment policy strategy. This isn't always necessarily the most reasonable assumption, and it's not always the most clinically relevant estimand. It's not always the most relevant treatment effect, but it is most easily estimated, and it requires the fewest assumptions. And I think that it leads to a more robust results, which is often the reason for that preference. But in order to achieve this level of retention, it does require full support from investigators and site staff and clinical operations staff. And it was something that we did not think was possible in the earlier days at Novo Nordisk, but now we've actually gotten very robust apparatus in place for managing this. So it is achievable and in fact routine these days. So that was my last slide.
Thank you very much, Brian. That was very stimulating, very interesting. Have anybody got any questions? And there are a couple of questions in the chat, or if anyone wants to put their hand up. So I'm not seeing any hands straight away. So Brian, can you see Francis's question in the chat there?
I'm trying to pull it up. So well, there are a few I see. Do I explicitly want to assess the impact of non-compliance in this trial? And well, yeah, that's a fair question. I think essentially what what we focused on was that there are two different targets of estimation that really are addressing two separate clinical questions of interest. And the primary clinical question of interest that was identified for this trial was attempting to remove, you could say, the impact of non-compliance. Although it's not entirely fair to label it non-compliance, since of course initiating rescue therapy is exactly according to treatment guidelines. It just it tends to equalize the treatment effects in both arms, and in a non-inferiority setting, this is challenging. It makes the interpretation more challenging. But that was the primary goal of the trial. And then you could say it was an additional goal to evaluate the impact of a treatment policy. So the two treatment policies, to compare them. And that includes the effect of non-compliance, you could say.
So that's really interesting to hear. And then Ian's asked a question that was right at the front of my mind, which was whether the regulators accepted, you managed to get the regulators to accept the hypothetical as a primary. I mean, you mentioned that they're very keen on treatment policy and collecting all the data. And I wondered if, obviously, you wanted to publish the hypothetical, but whether they actually went for it.
And I can say those were different days. So, yeah, I mean, we had partial success. It's actually been some. For example, FDA is pretty much a treatment policy fundamentalist, I would say. It's very, very difficult to get anything else into a label in the US. And they have good reasons for that, I would say, but it's extremely difficult. We've had somewhat more luck in Europe and elsewhere. So we do end up with this odd situation that sometimes we have results addressing different estimands in different labels around the world.
Yeah. Okay, I guess that's inevitable, although perhaps slightly unsatisfactory. Yeah. Thank you very much, Brian. It was really nice to have that perspective and the non-inferiority perspective. I
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much indeed for joining us, and a virtual round of applause.